Romans chapter 9 through 11 is a very long argument meant to answer the question, what about the Jews that don't believe in Jesus? And I really like to go back each week and try to summarize quickly the previous chapters to try and maintain this flow of thought that Paul is bringing to us as we embark on new verses. But so much has really been said in the last 10 weeks or so that the summary is getting longer and longer and longer. But there's a couple important points to be kept in mind as we venture into this last chapter of this argument. First of all, Israel holds a special status in redemptive history. All of the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises belong to them. This special status is not because they were beautiful or they did something great. God chose Jacob, or Israel, before he was born. God is sovereign. God gets to work out his redemptive plan how he sees fit. He can show mercy on whom he shows mercy. He can harden whom he wishes to accomplish his plan of redemption. He is the potter, and we are the clay. And as Israelite history marched on through the Old Testament, it was riddled with faithless behavior. Paul said Israel was zealous for God, but without knowledge. They didn't seek God in faith. They sought righteousness through law-keeping and moral adherence. They sought salvation by works through their own effort, when instead God saves by grace through faith. God declares people righteous through faith, patterned after Abraham. The object of this faith is always Jesus. Moses looked forward to Jesus descending from heaven and ascending from the abyss. In that passage we covered a couple of weeks ago. And then we saw that Isaiah saw Jesus as the king returning to Zion, a suffering servant, marred and disfigured. Moses, Isaiah, and Paul all agree that the good news was about Jesus. But the majority of Israel just couldn't see this. At the end of chapter 10, last week, Paul quoted Psalms 89, verses 9 and 10. And he used it as an illustration to make a point that Israel received so much special revelation about Jesus that they are without excuse. Even with unprecedented revelation given to them, they stumbled over Christ, the cornerstone. They refused to confess him as Lord, and they refused to believe in their heart that he was raised from the dead. So in chapter 11 begins, and Paul has established that the Jews are in a bad way when it comes to salvation and their relationship with God. Romans chapter 11, verses 1 in the first part of verse 2. Paul says, "Then I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew." So Paul begins with this rhetorical question that has been looming over the whole section. Has God rejected Israel? All these people that were described in the previous chapter, are they done? Are they dusted? Are they lost as a people forever? And he answers himself, by no means. Now, to defend this statement, Paul is going to give two proofs for why Israel is not written off from God's eternal plan. And we're going to look at these two proofs this morning. The first proof is Paul himself. Paul is saying that you need to look at me. I am a saved Christian who is an Israelite, who is from the tribe of Benjamin, who can trace his genetic bloodline all the way back to Abraham. If you're familiar with Paul's early years, he was once a persecutor of the church. He was zealous for the Lord, just like his countrymen, but his zeal was without knowledge of Jesus and the grace that he offered. So Paul shared the same bloodline as everyone that he's been talking about, but they are standing in opposition to God, and Paul is wrapped in the warm embrace of God's grace. Paul's point is this: if God saved me by grace and declared me righteous by faith, then God has not rejected Israel as a whole. If I'm here, God is not done with his people. And then he emphatically states, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. God made covenantal promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And no matter how mired in sin God's people got, God would not fail to fulfill those promises. Paul is stating a well-known fact from the Old Testament in this highlighted section, that God has not rejected his people. Paul makes an allusion to a time in Israel's history when they transitioned from being ruled by judges to being ruled by kings. In the early chapters of 1 Samuel, the people of Israel displayed their true colors when they asked to have a king just like the nations around them. They wanted to be like everybody else. But God was supposed to be their king. They were supposed to be different than the nations around them, not the same. So in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7, the Lord is speaking to Samuel, and he tells Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. So Samuel goes and obeys God, and he anoints Saul to be king over Israel. And Saul was exactly what the people had asked for. He was just like the nations around them. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, the prophet explained to the nation of Israel what a mess they had gotten in because they had asked for Saul. In 1 Samuel chapter 12, verses 19 through 22, he says, and all the people said to Samuel, pray for your servant to the Lord your God, that we may not die. For we have added to all of our sins this evil to ask for ourselves a king. And Samuel said to the people, do not be afraid. You have done all of this evil. Yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all of your heart. And do not turn aside after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are empty. For the Lord will not forsake his people. For his name is great, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people of himself, for himself. Samuel gives the reason God would not forsake Israel. It was not because the people were great. It was because God is great. And it was for God's great name. God had made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that were being fulfilled through this nation who he chose. And failure to deliver on those promises would reflect badly on God's great name. And that cannot be. It pleased God to choose Israel and Jacob. It pleased God to make covenantal promises with the forefathers. And as sure as his name is great, he will fulfill those promises. Now, from this allusion, Paul adds, in Romans chapter 11, verse 2, he says, whom he foreknew. God had foreknowledge of this. Israel's sin and their idolatry was not a surprise to God. It didn't catch him off guard. God has perfect foreknowledge. He is not bound by time. He sits outside of human history and can see every detail with perfect clarity, start to finish. And each time that humans sin and reject him, God has a plan in place to preserve a faithful remnant. God is in such control that he can take free-willed actions by humans to do evil and bring about his intended good from eternity past. Human free will and God's sovereignty can take place in the same event. No matter how bleak it looks or how deep the sin is, God will execute his plan and fulfill his promises. We're going to talk about some of that next week. So Paul's saying, God will not forsake his people. He knew they were going to be sinful before he chose them, and he's not writing them off because he's the one that made the promises. Even when it seems like everyone in Israel is rejecting God, God has a sovereign plan in place that is bigger than you can ever imagine. Now, the second proof, or the second example that Paul gives to defend against the idea that God is finished with Israel, comes from 1 Kings chapter 19. And he's citing from one of the darkest hours in Israel's history. Paul says this: God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Now, these two quotes come from 1 Kings chapter 19, and to really appreciate what Paul is saying here, we must go back, as is our custom in this class, go back and look at the context in the original portion of Scripture to see what Elijah and God are talking about. We need to see the context and the situation. So beginning in 1 Kings chapter 17, Elijah the prophet was called to confront the evil king of the northern tribes of Israel. His name was Ahab. He's the king of Israel. And he was more wicked than any king that had ever come before him. And he married a Sidonian princess named Jezebel, who was doubly wicked. Ahab adopted all of Jezebel's gods, the Baals and the Asheroth, and he built altars to Baal and worshipped this Asherah with his wife. Now, because of the king's idolatry, God sent a drought on the land. In 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 3. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except for my word. And the word of the Lord came to him, depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. So this pronouncement of judgment against the powerful king and his wicked wife turns into a 3-year-long showdown between them and the prophet of God, Elijah. And a drought of this magnitude would destroy crops, destroy pastures, dry up watering holes. And these are the things that the entire national economy depended on. This put enormous pressure on King Ahab, but it also highlighted the impotence of his fertility gods that he was worshiping. That's what Baal's specialty was, making the land fertile through rain. So during this time, Elijah became a wanted man. There was a price on his head, and God hid him and protected him until it was time for the big showdown on Mount Carmel. 3 years of drought go by, and God tells Elijah, it's time for you to go and see Ahab again. It's time for it to start to rain. So this is the reason in the background for the showdown on Mount Carmel. It was to demonstrate to Ahab and the people of Israel that Jehovah was God and not Baal. That it was Jehovah that controls the rain. It is Jehovah who is in control of the entire universe, and that it's Jehovah that can deliver them. So Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal to a contest. 450 prophets of Baal make an altar and sacrifice a bull. And Elijah did the same. And they set their sacrifices up. In the challenge of this contest between all of these prophets of Baal and the one prophet of God was that you have to light the fire of the altar with no matches, with no flint, without a bow drill, without a torch. The only thing that you can use is the power of your God. You guys call on Baal, and I will call on Jehovah. In the end, the prophets of Baal made themselves look foolish. Their idolatry was powerless, and Yahweh sent fire down from heaven in dramatic fashion. At the end of chapter 18, the people of Israel are cheering, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." And Elijah commanded the people of Israel to seize all of those prophets, take them into the valley, and Elijah slaughtered them there. God's power was on full display. The people are chanting God's name. The evil prophets of Baal have been slaughtered, and rain is coming on the horizon. All of this by the power of God. Surely with all of this, there has to be change in the nation. Either Ahab and Jezebel are going to repent, seeing that Jehovah is more powerful than Baal, or the people who are chanting, "The Lord is God," are going to throw these two knuckleheads out of office. The only way this can end is either in revival or revolution. So after the Mount Carmel showdown, Elijah, by the power of God, runs to the gate of Jezreel. This is the place where Jezebel's palace was. He runs to the gate, and he's been a wanted man. He's been in hiding, but now he's standing right at the gate of the city. And this is where Ahab is going. He's going to tell his wife what happened to all of her prophets. And I think Elijah went there to pop some popcorn and watch the show. It's either revival or revolution, but either one's going to be fun to watch. But when Jezebel found out that all of her prophets were dead, she sent a message to Elijah. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 2. Then Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." And then he was afraid, and he arose, and he ran for his life. Elijah just spent 3 years under God's protection. He stood his ground against 450 prophets of Baal, faithfully trusting in God to deliver, and God won the battle for him in dramatic fashion. But then his heart fainted in fear when the outcome was not what he expected. Jezebel threatens his life, and nothing had changed. There was no revival, there was no revolution, and he ran for his life. Verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Elijah is so distraught that he wants to give up and die. He went from faith is our victory to fear that God can't protect him or deliver him from an evil woman. As Elijah is sleeping under this broom tree in the desert, the angel of the Lord comes and provides and sustains him with food and water. The angel of the Lord actually provides a cake of bread cooked over coals to give him strength. And this is a flat cake bread that was similar to the unleavened bread that was eaten by the Israelites as they fled Egypt. And it was also similar to the bread cakes that they made out of manna when they were in the desert wanderings. And I think it's important for us to see the big picture of what's going on. Step back and look at this storyline and see that big overarching picture. The angel of the Lord is with him in the desert, and he's sustaining him in a similar manner as he did for Israel during the Exodus. So Elijah's in the wilderness. He's weak, he's exhausted, he's fearful, and he's faltering in his faith. In 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 8, it says, "And he arose and he ate and drank." This is the bread and the water that the angel of the Lord provides for him. "And he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God." Again, to really appreciate this, you have to know what's going on. You have to know that Mount Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. They're the same place. This narrative shows in dramatic fashion what spiritual regression looks like. Israel's history of the Exodus was well documented. If you remember the story, God revealed himself on Mount Sinai before Moses and gave the law. And the people, they broke the covenant of the law that God gave them, and Moses had to intercede on the mountaintop in prayer. Moses said, "Show me your glory." And God passed by Moses and revealed his glory while Moses was hid in the cleft of the rock, and then the covenant was renewed. Then they wandered in the desert for 40 years while the faithless generation died off. And then the conquest into the promised land under Joshua, where they were supposed to eradicate all of the idol-worshiping pagans of the Canaan land. But now we see Elijah doing the exact opposite. He was eradicating the pagan worshipers in the Canaan land. And then he runs from that promised land. He goes through a 40-day wilderness wandering sustained by the Lord. And he ends up on Mount Sinai, hiding in a cave in a cleft of the rock, where he meets with God in a very similar fashion to what Moses experienced. Elijah is going the wrong way. He's running away from the promised land because his faith is faltering. And he's afraid. He's in crisis. So Elijah is on Mount Sinai. He's hiding in a cave, and God speaks to him. First Kings chapter 19, verses 9 and 10. "And there he came to a cave, and he lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" What are you doing here? He wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be in the promised land doing prophets type of stuff. But instead, he had regressed spiritually because of a lack of faith. And he was hiding in a cave because he didn't trust God to protect him from Jezebel. He had regressed all the way back to Mount Sinai. Verse 10, he says, "And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of armies. For the sons of Israel have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they have sought to take my life." This is the quote that Paul picks up in Romans. Without context, you would not know that Elijah is falling apart and making this statement in faithless fear. In Romans chapter 10, Paul describes Israel's pursuit of righteousness as zeal without knowledge. Paul could attest to that because he too was zealous for God when he was persecuting the church. Pursuing righteousness, pursuing the promises of God by your own efforts and by your own zeal, and not by faith in the one who has demonstrated the ability to deliver. This is what Elijah is demonstrating now. Zeal without knowledge, zeal without faith. He didn't trust God in his ability to deliver. And it regressed him all the way back to Mount Sinai, when he should have been looking forward to a better mountain on Mount Zion. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. And he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountain and broke it in pieces and rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper." So Elijah gets to Mount Sinai, gets this Mount Sinai experience, similar to what Moses and the Israelites had witnessed. And God tells him, "Come on out and stand on the mountain before me as I pass by." But Elijah stays in the cave, sheltered by the rocks. And God puts on a display that represents Mount Sinai, and it represents the old law. Wind that rips the rocks apart, and the earthquake that shook the mountain, and fire that burns everything up. But the Lord is not in those things. And God then presents himself in a low whisper, a soft voice. And I believe that God's trying to show Elijah is that you can't stand on Mount Sinai that you've returned to. The burden of it is so great that you cannot come out of the cave. The law that Mount Sinai represented was a shadow of what was to come. It pointed to and represented something greater that Elijah had taken his eyes off of. And God is calling to him in a gentle whisper of grace to come out and head towards Mount Zion. Listen to what the Hebrew writer says along the same vein. Hebrew writer, this is one of the warning passages that he gives, warning Hebrew Christians not to go back to the old law. Don't go backwards. He says, "For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and tempest and a sound of trumpets and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further message be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given, if even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying that the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, and to the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks better than the blood of Abel. See to it that you do not refuse him who is speaking." When Elijah ran, he felt that he was the only one left, the last righteous person in Israel, and he ran to preserve his life. This is works-based salvation, trying to save yourself through your own effort. God's revealing on Mount Sinai was to show that works-based salvation cannot be endured, but the soft voice of God's grace can. By grace, you can come out of the cave and stand before God. Back in 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 13. When Elijah heard it, when he heard that soft voice calling to him, he wrapped his face in his cloak, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, I have been zealous for the Lord, the God of armies, for the sons of Israel have abandoned your covenant, tore down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they have sought to take my life. God asks him the same question for a second time, and Elijah gives him the same answer. Elijah still feels alone. He's still struggling. And because of this, God reveals his plan to deliver Israel and make good on his promises. I'm going to pull back the curtain and give you some information here, Elijah. This is God letting Elijah know that it is not your work, that it is God's work. God is telling him that I have everything under control. You need to trust in me. Verse 15, he says, and the Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah, you shall appoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death. And the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. This last part that's highlighted is the other verse that Paul picks up in Romans. God is telling Elijah to get back into the game and trust me. It might look bleak to you, but God says, I have 7,000 faithful souls in Israel that you don't even know about. If the king of Syria doesn't protect them, then Jehu, the king of Israel, is going to. And if Jehu doesn't protect him, then Elisha is going to. I have this all under control. I have it all worked out. God made promises to his people, and he has preserved a remnant. And it is not by works of any man. It is by grace through faith. Even when times are really, really bad, when Israel appeared to be lost in the eyes of God's prophet Elijah, God had a sovereign plan in place to protect a remnant to fulfill his promises. So Paul asks the question, has God rejected Israel? He says, not at all. He promised never to forsake his people because his name is great. And he gives two proofs. Paul, he says, I'm an Israelite, saved by grace through faith, with a pedigree that traces all the way back to the DNA of Abraham. Paul is saying, if I am here, then it's not over for Israel. And the second proof comes from 1 Kings. Even when it seems like all hope is lost, God has a plan in place to make good on his promises. Elijah couldn't see that when he lost his faith, and he experiences a spiritual regression. But God has shown Elijah that he has everything under control. God's plan was intact to preserve a remnant by grace through faith. And Paul goes on in Romans chapter 11, verses 5 and 6, and he says, so too at the present time there is a remnant, chosen by grace, but if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace would no longer be grace. In these verses, Paul is looking back at the example that he gave from Elijah's time. He says, so too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. If God preserved a remnant of Israel in those dark days of Elijah, so too, at the time Paul is writing in 56 AD, God has preserved a remnant for Israel. And the remnant is chosen by grace. The language Paul uses to explain how God chose this remnant goes all the way back to the beginning of his argument in chapter 9, when he explained the development of the nation of Israel. It started with Abraham, the father of our faith, and then the promised son of Isaac to the exclusion of Ishmael, and then lastly to Jacob, chosen by grace before he was born so that works could never be a part of earning God's favor. Romans chapter 9, verse 10, this is how Paul explained it at the beginning of his argument. And not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had nothing to do either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election or choosing might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. What Paul is saying is that God has this sovereign plan for Israel. God chose the nation of Israel in Jacob by grace and not by works. And then he preserved a remnant at the time of Elijah by grace and not by works. And he is still preserving a remnant at the time of Paul's writing by grace, not by works. Next week, Paul is going to examine in the next few passages the portion of Israel who is not part of that chosen remnant at the time of his writing. Come back next week and we'll look at that. Thank you.